The next speaker is Anna Strob. She's a PhD candidate from the Department of Chinese Studies at the University of Tübingen. She works, as I understand, about the Kongji, gezhi, isn't it? Under the supervision of Professor Hans Ulrich Vogel. About the subject matter of her PhD thesis is a very interesting one. So I'm sure we are going to listen to something new and interesting, and even because Anna Strob has already published on this subject. We are also eagerly expecting an article from her to our contemporarysenses.org. Thank you, Anna Strob.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Professor Cavallo. I think I first start sharing my screen. You can see it? It works? Okay, perfect. Yeah, thanks again. Also to Nicolas for organizing and coordinating this whole event. Yeah, and also to Professor Menard. I must say it's a very hard task now after his fantastic talk to give my presentation, but maybe I can add something to the conversation. So in today's presentation, I will introduce you to selected passages of my translation and analysis of the Kongji, a treatise written by the Italian Jesuit missionary Alfonso Vagnone around 1633 as a Chinese adaptation of the Coimbra commentaries on Aristotle's natural philosophy. My research focuses on the first volume, or Duan, of the treatise, which offers an introduction to the theory of the four Aristotelian elements and their activities and interactions in the sublunar world. To approach this, I will briefly locate the Kongji in the corpus of publications by Jesuit missionaries in China in the early 17th century that focused mostly on the transmission of Renaissance science and Aristotelian natural philosophy. We will then examine the structure and main topics dealt with throughout the text and investigate selected passages of it. With this, I attempt to approach an answer to the question on how the missionary author envisioned the material world and cosmos at that time, and how he conveyed this knowledge to his Chinese readership. If time allows, I will conclude this presentation with a short insight into my preliminary findings on how this knowledge was integrated into the philosophical and scientific discourse in late imperial China. The Kongji can generally be understood as an explanation of the phenomena below the lunar sphere, based on the theory of the four Aristotelian elements, as can be seen by the following overview given in Thierry Menard's article on Aristotelian works in 17th century China, an updated survey and new analysis that built on Hubert Verheiren's previous research on this topic. The Kongji was part of a general attempt by the Jesuit missionaries to translate the Aristotelian text corpus into Chinese in the early 17th century. So far, the main Aristotelian sources for the Chinese translation of the first volume of the Kongji have been identified as Aristotle's De Caelo and his De Generatione et Corruptione. Here, the particularities of the four elementary substances are explored and how they make up the material composition of the sublunar realm. For the second volume, it is Aristotle's De Meteorologica, where the focus is on the interactions of the elements and the phenomena that are created by their transformations. According to Nicholas' standard, the Kongji falls into the phase of transmission that saw more systematic and organized efforts on parts of the Jesuits to introduce Renaissance science and teachings to the Chinese cultural elite. Okay. To better understand the process of knowledge transmission in its historical context, we may look at the official policy established by the missionaries to make their doctrines fit with the long-lasting tradition of Chinese philosophy and cosmology. This policy, that is better known as the method of accommodation, was applied in most of the Jesuit works in Chinese in the early 17th century. Linguistically, this meant to appropriate existing terms mostly drawn from the Confucian and Neo-Confucian traditions and to adopt them for their own scientific argument. In Peter Berg's terms, this describes the decontextualization of specific vocabulary, that is to reach out to appropriate something alien, and then the recontextualization of terms, that is domesticating them for one's own purposes. Culturally, this meant that Vagnone took to China's scholar elite and crafted works mainly in reaction to their demands and interests, attempting to establish the missionaries and their teachings as an alien authority on the Chinese cultural plane. The result of this approach was that Christian teachings were transmitted using European science and technology as an entry point, aiming at establishing relations and reference points for later conversion. This method, first applied by Matteo Ricci at the end of the 16th century, should influence and inform the apologetic agenda of the Jesuits in China throughout the next century. We will see that the Kongji gezhi is an outstanding example of this approach. When it comes to ideas, concepts, and theories, the text is firmly rooted in the Aristotelian tradition and in Renaissance sciences before the so-called scientific revolution in Europe. When it comes to terms and expressions, it is much at home in Chinese philosophy and thought tradition. To approach the analysis and translation of the text, we will first look at the structure of the Kongji gezhi and the various topics dealt with throughout the different chapters. This is going to be a cursory overview of the composition of the text and the author's main arguments. So here we have the index of the Kongji gezhi. We see that we have 25 headings or chapters in total. In addition to the headings, we have the page numbers given. So the chapters here, 1 to 10, marked in blue, represent a general introduction or gonglun to the theory of the four elements. And everything that is introduced here is used as a reference point in subsequent chapters in the second part of the book. The second half of the first volume, or Tuan, is described as Silun, that is a detailed discussion on the features of every single element. It is here that we see Aristotle's natural philosophy put into practice and related to key scientific ideas still held in Renaissance Europe. As this is not the focus of today's presentation, I will leave this part out for now. As you can see here, the first part of the book covers topics such as the categories of pure and composite substances, the primary qualities of the elements in relation to their respective weight and motions. The concept of form is introduced in the 6th chapter, and Vagnone gives an account of the spatial extension of the layers of the elements. We are also introduced to the 9 celestial spheres and the idea of a prime mover, followed by a thorough introduction to Aristotle's concept of motion, natural as well as forced, and the concept of natural places related to it. The first part of the book ends with details on the elements as pure substances. For today's presentation, I have chosen passages from the introduction and the chapters 3, 4, and 6 to demonstrate the attempt of Vagnone to introduce fundamental elements of Aristotle's natural philosophy to the Chinese reader. As said, the concepts introduced in the first half of the book resonate throughout the whole text and are the foundation for all that follows in the second part. We will see that though the four elements are introduced by applying key terms drawn from the Chinese cosmological descriptions, Vagnone closely follows the arguments listed in Aristotle's Corpus and Natural Philosophy. So the introduction reads as follows to the text. The traces of alterations one observes in the sky are numerous, marvelous, and outstanding. Now, I will give you a brief account of the study into its why being so, something that the ancient teaching of investigating things to expand knowledge always found difficult. First, we must elucidate the true root of the alterations. Only after that can we move on to greater detail. As to its true root, it is none other than the 4 primary elements, which are called fire, air, water, and earth. This very first passage is already a testament of the complex task Vagnone is undertaking in explaining Aristotle's version of the cosmos to the Chinese reader. He opens his text with a eulogy to the phenomena observed in the sky and then directly moves on to his scientific inquiry into what causes them. To his judgment, it is exactly this inquiry that the Chinese ancient sciences never got right, and that therefore needed an introduction to the theories coming from the far west to solve the questions about the origins of these natural changes. With this, he introduces the main topic of the text, that is the Aristotelian theory on the primary constituent of things, namely the four elements of fire, air, water, and earth. The ancient teaching Vagnone is referring to here is none other than the Neo-Confucian idea of fathoming things to expound one's knowledge, founded upon the writings of the Zhengzhou school and perfected mostly in Zhuxi's Compendium on Nature and Principle, his Xingyi Daquan. With Zhuxi as the most authoritative representative of Neo-Confucian doctrine in late Ming China, he is the main target for criticism in the Kongji gezhi, without ever being named directly. We move on to chapter 3. It is here that Vagnone introduces the main parts of Aristotle's cosmology by evolving his ideas and conceptions on the theory of the elements in relation to the number 4. The following arguments listed in this chapter are key elements of Aristotle's cosmology and therefore build the foundation for the rest of the text. The chapter tells us how Vagnone approached the translation or the introduction of Aristotle's natural philosophy to his Chinese reader, not in a direct translation, but by adapting selected ideas and concepts and accommodating them to the Chinese linguistic and cultural context. The Kongji gezhi presents itself as a corrected discourse on the patterns and principles of nature, based on the theory of the four elements, that is, a corrected version of Zhuxi's Compendium on Nature and Principle. The complexity of Vagnone's attempt becomes obvious because of the comprehensiveness of the theory and its various components that not only have to be newly introduced and explained to the Chinese reader, but simultaneously must be put into contrast to the already existing and prevailing image of the natural world and the Chinese cosmological knowledge. This is the intro to the chapter. In ancient times, there were some who singled out only one among the four elements as the mother of all myriad things. Their theories were all different and could not be reconciled with each other. Afterwards, all famous philosophers resented this supposition, and it was decided that 4 was the accurate number of elements. There were said to be the 4 elements of earth, water, air, fire, no more nor less. The persuasiveness of this argument lies in the reference to the ancient times and the authority of the famous philosophers. References to antiquity, former times, philosophers or experts are abundant throughout the Kongji gezhi. Mostly these words are directed at ancient Greek philosophers, at contemporary of Aristotle or Aristotle himself. Yet the idea of one single substance or element as the source of all things, as mentioned in this passage, is not only found among Greek philosophers, but was also debated in Chinese cosmology. Benjamin Ellman in this context refers to Fang Yizi, a scholar of the 17th century, who, I quote, presented an ambiguous account in which he explained that even in Chinese classical learning, there had not been unanimity on whether there are 4 or 5 or 6 phases. Vagnone then lists several arguments to prove his theory on the 4 primary constituents of things. His arguments contain the core of Aristotle's natural philosophy and are repeated throughout the text whenever the Jesuit author tries to convince his Chinese interlocutor of the truth of his theory. He starts with an account on the 4 properties or qualities of the elements. So firstly, let us speak of the merging of the primary properties. Scattered over all the myriad things, there are only 4 primary properties, 2 which are mainly active and giving, namely heat and cold, and 2 which are mainly passive and receiving, namely dryness and moisture. Cold and heat belong to yang, whereas dryness and moisture belong to yin. So when we think of the passage Professor Menard has been introducing of Matteo Ricci, I think this resonates quite well with this. So now let them combine in any order. When, for instance, heat and dryness merge together and turn into fire, then the nature of fire is extremely hot and secondarily dry. Or let us say both properties are extreme and none is second in rank. They will still connect though, like when moisture and heat merge together, air is formed. And when coldness and moisture melt into each other, they become water. Dryness and coldness combined form earth. What is fascinating in this passage is Vagnone's use of the Chinese terms yin and yang. Though thoroughly embedded in Chinese cosmological thinking, they blend smoothly into his account and do not distract the reader from the Aristotelian context conveyed in this passage. At the very end of the first volume of the Kongji gezhi, this illustration is found. It shows the interactions of the four elementary substances and their respective dispositions that are either contradicting or balancing each other. The idea of the different qualities of the elements lies at the very heart of the theory of constant change and transformation as we see it in the sublunar realm. The generation of things and the transformation of one element into another is only possible because of the primary and secondary qualities which can be combined in any order. Yet as beautifully illustrated in this drawing, contraries like heat and cold or dryness and moisture are not to be found in one element together and are mutually exclusive. An explanation of this we find, for instance, in Aristotle's De Generatione et Corruptione, where he states the impossibility of contraries to form couples, as the same thing cannot possibly be hot and cold or moist and dry at the same time. Next to the concept of the four primary elements, Vagnone adds the idea of light and heavy substances that is fundamental to Aristotle's order in the cosmos and his core concept of movement and rest. Fire is established as the lightest among the four and earth as the heaviest. Air is the second lightest and water the second heaviest one. Composites are ranked according to their predominant constituent. The hierarchical order, which follows from the relative weight of the elements, is mirrored in Aristotle's conception about movement and natural places, a topic that is picked up in the next passage. The concept of motion is one of the most prominent topics of Aristotle's natural philosophy. Introduced mainly in his De Physica, it dominates the discourse in the De Caelo even further. In this passage here, Vagnone contrasts the circular motion of the heavens to the linear motions of the elements. In relation to their weight, these are again differentiated as extreme and secondary. Earth as the heaviest is bound to the center, fire as the lightest is to reach upwards to the heavens. Water as the second heaviest one dwells on the earth's surface, and air as the second lightest is bound to the region below the element fire. The idea of linear and circular motion follows logically from Aristotle's discourse on the qualities and weight of the elements. This is emphasized in this passage as the author speaks of primary, pure and mixed, original and circular motion, terms which are also related to the concepts of weight, quality and place. With this, Vagnone establishes from the beginning of the text a consistent vocabulary that relates to the main philosophical and cosmological ideas conveyed throughout the chapters. It is in the 6th chapter that Vagnone further establishes his notion of the composition of the world and cosmos. In this chapter, he details his idea of the forms or shapes of the elements and the surrounding heavens. So it starts as follows. In ancient times, some said that heaven is round and earth is flat or square. They also said that water, air, and fire are without fixed form, and their bodies merely take on the form of the vessel in which they reside. It is because the heavens move in circular motion that they ought to be of round form. Yet as the four elements move linearly, why should they necessarily be round? It is only in Aristotle's Xingli Zhenglun, so corrected discourse on the organizing pattern of nature, that we find an answer to this. It states that the four primary elements inevitably are round, and there are two reasons for that. The first reason given is, first, the Xingli Zhengden states that the entirety of the universe forms, perfectly forms one globe. And this perfect globe is formed by the 5 big entities, namely the heavens, fire, air, water, and earth. They all ought to be shaped spherically. Now, as we have already commented on above, the heavens are round, and thus the remaining 4 entities are also round. He continues, second, the Xingli Zhengden states that the 4 elements below the moon layer heaven are all tangent to each other, and there is no empty space between them. Since the realm above the 4 elements is round, then the lower realm must adhere to this too. Supposing the sublunar region would be of a different form, then the perimeter of the center of the Earth would not form a circle either. Since the Earth's surface is without exception round, water and air, which are contiguous to the Earth's surface, are all without exception round too. When we look at this illustration taken from Matteo Ricci's world map, the image Vagnone tries to describe with words maybe becomes clearer. We see the 9 spherical heavens enveloping the sublunar sphere with its layers of air and fire and air, and the terraqueous globe resting at its center. Mostly in the Kongji gezhi, Vagnone focuses on the sublunar world and includes information on the celestial spheres only to offer the idea of an everlasting continuum in contrast to the constantly changing sublunar world. When reading his account, one might expect that Vagnone was quite successful in his rendering of Aristotle's natural philosophy into Chinese. Yet, as has been stated at the beginning of this talk, the complexity of the task of transmission was not only in translating and adapting Aristotelian notions and conceptions into the Chinese linguistic sphere. The terminology and expressions adopted and appropriated by the missionary author were deeply rooted in Chinese thought tradition and dominated by their cosmological and philosophical conceptions. So being aware of the dominance of the long-lasting tradition of Chinese philosophy and cosmology, Vagnone took this head-on and directly challenged one of the core aspects of their tradition in the following chapter. It is in the chapter on the question whether metal and wood are primary elements or not, where the core of Chinese cosmological conception and gestalt of the 5 faces or wuxing is targeted, and the idea of qi as a mere elementary substance, namely air, is established and suggested to the Chinese reader. This passage is an outstanding example of the different linguistic means and way of argumentation applied by Vagnone throughout the first part of the Kongji gezhi. Vagnone picks on the Aristotelian idea of pure and composite bodies to emphasize the fact that metal and wood cannot be understood as primary elements. That the Jesuits acted on the assumption of the Chinese 5 faces as elementary substances accentuates the fundamental differences which underlie those 2 colliding views on nature and cosmos, as well as the intricacy of any cultural translation requiring a sound understanding of both cosmological and linguistic conceptions involved. Thus, this passage deserves closer reading as it gives us insight into the understanding and perception the Jesuits had of the Chinese cosmological system. The passage starts in form of a dialogue between a Chinese interlocutor and our author, and is again very close to what we have read about Matteo Ricci's translation about the 4 elementary substances. The Chinese scholar says, in my country, since ancient times, we have the theory of the 5 faces. In addition to your 3 xing of earth, water, and fire, we have metal and wood, and by this the 5 faces are completed. I do not know whether this theory is the same as your Western learning. I answer, Matteo Ricci already in former times used questions and answers to expound on the theory of the 4 elements. Only the primary elements are of utmost purity, and since they are pure, there necessarily is nothing admixed to them. Vagnone continues, when we examine and observe the forming of the myriad things, they are generally not formed by metal and wood. For this, the various categories of humans, lower animals, birds, and beasts can serve as an example. Therefore, as to metal and wood, they cannot constitute primary elements of the myriad things. Furthermore, who does not know that metal and wood are actually composites of water, fire, and earth? And in the case of composites, they cannot constitute primary elements. Assuming that composites can constitute primary elements, then plants, stones, and other such things were equally suitable to be placed in line with the primary elements. But then again, they could not be restricted to 5. Why then only select metal and wood? So having established his notion of the 4 primary elements now as all material or corporally things under the moon, of which everything else is composed, Vagnone tried to do away with the Chinese wuxing and the dynamic cycles of growth and decay related to them. In contrast to the 4 Aristotelian elements, the 5 phases were generally understood as a system to describe constant change within the cosmos, the world, and society at large. Here I quote Professor Lloyd. Chinese cosmological accounts often started from an assumption of an undifferentiated state that began to be transformed once yin and yang started to become differentiated. But undifferentiated qi came to be modified, producing the cycles of creation and destruction, which are associated with the so-called 5 phases. The cycle of the activities related to the 5 phases occur regularly during these time cycles. The cycle of creation or generation reads as follows. So wood generates fire, fire generates earth, earth generates metal, metal generates water, water generates wood. The cycle of destruction or mutual conquest goes as follows. Metal overcomes wood, water overcomes fire, wood overcomes earth, and so forth. So what can be taken from this is the fact that the Chinese wuxing were definitely not understood by Chinese scholars as material constituents of things. It is relatively safe to assume that the main purpose of this chapter was to write a new narrative for the term xing, or element. So one important twist in the Jesuit strategy to adopt established Chinese terms and concepts like qi and xing lies in the fact that they, in Zhang Qiong's words, did not admit these terms for what they represented within the Chinese tradition, but rather for what they would represent after they were remodeled in conformity with the corresponding Christian, and in our case, Aristotelian conceptions. The chapter on the question whether metal and wood are elements or not is therefore emblematic for the way Vagnone was openly and directly challenging the Chinese narrative of the workings of nature. In rendering the theory of the 5 phases ad absurdum, he tries to expose the supposed weaknesses of the theory and to contest it directly with his own account of things, while completely missing the point about the dynamic structure of the cosmos the Chinese imagined with this theory of continuous change and transformation. The chapter therefore simply ends with a statement that with all these absurdities listed, one can only hold to the fact that the theory of the 5 phases cannot be true. So with all that in mind, I guess the question arises what fate the Kongji gezhi met after its publication at the end of Ming China, and how the cosmological construct it offered was read and received by the Chinese reader. The question of the history of reception is fundamental to our analysis of the translation of the text, as it is in the reaction of the Chinese that the actual dialogue between these two worldviews took place. It is in the written statements by Chinese scholars, either in form of a direct reflection on transmitted knowledge, or in the process of evolving their own scientific argument in their works, that we see how this knowledge is put into practice and comes to life in a new context, with new intentions, and sometimes with added misunderstandings. So Chinese sources from the 17th and 18th centuries tell us that the Kongji gezhi did not suffer from complete oblivion after its publication at times of dynastic decline. The text is generally studied as part of the Jesuit missionaries' more or less systematic attempt to transmit Renaissance science and natural philosophy to China. It has not been integrated into the Sigu Quanshu itself, but has been critically mentioned in the Zongmu section, that is the table of contents of the complete library of the 4 treasuries. The Zongmu again contains the description of the books that have been included in the Imperial Library, and also commentaries on the books which have not been included, like in case of the Kongji gezhi. This was not unusual for Jesuit publications, especially for works with a religious taint, but it implies that the text during later Qing times only circulated in form of handwritten copies. From the comment on the Kongji gezhi, we learned that the depreciation for the book derived mainly from its take on Chinese traditional cosmology and its attempt to do away with the established Wuxing-centered worldview. This is confirmed by Chen Zuhui, who explores in his recently published article the reception and reading of the theory of the four Aristotelian elements during late Qing times, namely after the Opium War and the renewed interest in Western sciences that followed these events. In Chen's account, it was the systematicity with which Aristotle's theory was introduced in the Kongji gezhi that attracted a new readership. Still, the religious content, something I did not elaborate on in my talk today, was also well noted and the book branded as heterodox teaching. With this, one of the main inhibiting factors that should prevent the knowledge conveyed in the Vagnone's Kongji gezhi to spread further was eventually Renaissance scholasticism that so thoroughly marked the Jesuits' educational background. It should be mentioned here that the very separation of scientific inquiry from religious ambition should eventually formulate one of the most important successes of the so-called scientific revolution taking place in Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries. Yet to truly grasp the reception of the text by Chinese scholars, we must look at the scientific and philosophical discourse that evolved in China in the 17th century. This discourse was much marked by renewed interest in the composition of the natural world. Most of the scholars contributing to this discourse were either actively involved in the compilation of Chinese translations of Western natural philosophy or strongly attracted to the intellectual challenge it posed for traditional Chinese thought and cosmology. Their involvement, interest, and reaction varied from total acceptance of Western learning, including the religious aspects of the missionaries' writings, to an adoption or integration of selected components of their work, up to a vehement rejection and condemnation of their teachings. So it is in the second group that we find the greatest resonance to Western thought on natural philosophy and Aristotle's teachings on the four elementary substances. Its most prominent agents can be found in Xiong Minyu and scholars that fall in line with his teachings like Fang Yizi, Jie Xuan, You Yi, or Wang Wonghan. Xiong's works subsequently was used as a blueprint for these other scholars who should eventually leave their imprint on the discourse on the natural world in the Chinese intellectual sphere throughout the 17th and early 18th centuries. So this is a preliminary list of works which either hold direct references to the Kongji gezhi or have adapted some of the theories and arguments elaborated in Vagnone's text. Topics that echo throughout these Chinese works are the sphericity of the earth, the three-region theory of the element air, and the natural phenomena formed in these regions, as well as the concept of the four elementary substances and their qualities. So all these examples do not yet satisfyingly answer the question to the history of reception of the Kongji gezhi, yet I hope they still leave an impression of how these Jesuit Chinese translations found their way into the Chinese discourse on the natural world in late imperial times. So thank you very much.